Okay, we are ready to start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this program hosted by the Inclusion Initiative of the London School of Economics. It's 8 a.m. in New York, actually 5 a.m. in San Francisco, 9 p.m. here in Singapore, 1 p.m. in London, and we have panelists and members of the audience joining us live from right around the world. My name is Lutfey Siddiqi, and I'll be chairing the panel today. Some quick housekeeping points. This event is being recorded, and we expect to publish the recording on our channels. It's also going out on Facebook Live. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible, so please ask questions on Zoom using the Q&A function, and please do identify yourself when you're asking the question. Today, on November 24th, 2021, we celebrate 1 year of the Inclusion Initiative, or TII, thanks to the generous donation of the Nesbitt and Lawler families. In this brief period, TII has made quite a splash under the directorship of Dr. Grace Lordan. TII has published research in major journals, in international media, conducted numerous events, public and closed door, produced thought leadership on our rapidly changing working context, already making impact, engaging with, influencing the industry across the seas. Grace may elaborate on some of the projects that are underway, but I'm particularly excited about the Growth and Governance Hub that will be launched in February, which will create measurements for the S in ESG, and thanks to funding from the Nandalingam Family Office. So let's jump straight in. Inclusion in global markets. That is our title today. What is the state of the union when it comes to diversity and inclusion in global organizations operating in global financial centers? No, seriously, behind the corporate PR, how is it actually going? How have inclusion policies evolved over the years, and how effective are they today? What have we learned? What has changed for the better? What has become worse? What are some of the useful lessons? And what are some of the issues to watch out for? These are the questions that I'm looking forward to exploring with our panel. I hope you'll all appreciate just how distinguished and accomplished these industry leaders are, and the diversity of perspectives, backstories, and personal journeys that they represent. I will introduce each one of them one at a time just before I invite them to make their opening remarks. Once we've heard from Bear, Dawid, Ida, and Philip, alphabetically in that order, Grace will share some insights from behavioral science and present a new framework that we've been working on to help make teams more inclusive and effective. Okay, so Beatrice Martin. Bear is Global Group Treasurer and Group CEO for UK at UBS. As Treasurer, she manages liquidity, funding, capital, and allocation of financial resources to align with group strategy. She also drives cross-border business strategic initiatives across the group and plays a leadership role in regulatory and operational matters. Previously, she served as Managing Director at Morgan Stanley, where she was Head of European Fixed Income Bank Solutions and a member of the Interest Rate and Credit Operating Committees. Just last week, I saw that Bear was named Outstanding Top 20 Ally Executive Role Model in London. Bear, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Lutfey. This is my absolute pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for having me. Inclusion, diversity, and inclusion is certainly something that is very, very close to my heart. I think on all the accomplishments that you've mentioned, I think the outstanding is probably the most recent one, and one I am really proud of. I think it's been really interesting to see how the DE&I agenda has been evolving over the last years in the banking space. As Lutfey alluded to, actually, I met Lutfey many years ago at Deutsche Bank, as we were both trainees on the trading floor, and then went to Morgan Stanley and came here. So my whole professional life, I've been in banking, and I quite enjoy the banking industry. There is no doubt that there is much more to be done with regards to DE&I, so diversity, equity, and inclusion. And banks have already done a lot, and I'm very happy to be here today to talk about the things that we've done, the things that we think we can do better. I think for me, it's been an amazing professional career, because I never actually saw myself as somebody that was different in the banking industry. I never saw myself as a diversity candidate. But, it's really interesting as I grew up in the organization, the realization of where decisions are being made in the senior ranks and how important is to be inclusive of different perspectives. And you get that through gender, you get that through ethnicity, you get that through social background. So there are many ways to be inclusive in the global markets. And so I hope today we're going to have a great discussion about that. And I'm really, really looking forward to it.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Bea. I'll come back to you with a question that I've just noted down. Next up, it's Dawid. Dawid Konotey-Ahulu, founder of the award-winning pensions advisory firm, Reddington. Dawid started his career as a barrister of Lincoln's Inn, subsequently spending 16 years as an investment banker. In 2006, he left Merrill Lynch and co-founded Reddington, and subsequently Mallow Street, which is now the established specialist online community for the UK pensions industry. Most recently, Dawid co-founded 10,000 Black Interns, which, as the name suggests, is placing 10,000 talented Black graduates in firms across 24 sectors in the United Kingdom over the next 5 years. Dawid, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Well, Lutfey, thanks so much for this opportunity. It's a real privilege. I've known you and followed you, close and afar for many years. Of course, you're great friends, as I think is Bea, with my co-founder and business partner, Rob Gardner, and my co-conspirator. We like starting stuff together, and our journey began, I want to say, almost 20 years ago together. So, I was a Merrill guy, and I was hearing all things amazing about Deutsche down the road. And even when Rob came to join me at Merrill, the first year, all he told me was how much better Deutsche was at everything that we did. And your name, Lutfey, came up a lot. I know he holds you in his huge regard. So thank you again for inviting me. I guess, look, I've been in this industry now for over 3 decades now, maybe 34, 35 years. I started life as a lawyer, as you said, and then I became an investment banker. It was a pretty circuitous route. And for most of that time, I think a bit like Bea, I didn't see myself particularly as a diversity candidate. I just got on and did my job. But, my career had started at the bar. And I just tell this story because it kind of illustrates a little bit what I like to call a kink in the hosepipe. You're out watering the garden and the water stops flowing, and you realize that there's, you think someone turned the tap off, and then you realize, oh no, there's a kink in the hosepipe, right? And so you unkink it, and then you realize that the water still doesn't flow. So you think, well, that doesn't make any sense. Then you realize actually there's a lot of kinks. So you unkink all the kinks, and then the water flows. And I think life is sometimes a bit like that. There are kinks in the hosepipe. And particularly if you come from a minority, then there are specific kinks that you face as if you're a woman, or if there's maybe something from a race perspective, or neurodiversity. There's a whole bunch of different kinks, different people. And my example was 1987, I think. I was trying to get my job as a barrister, junior barrister, and I wanted to get taken on for pupillage, which is what the bar calls, rather quaintly calls their internships. And so I had this interview, and it went pretty well. It was all pretty good. They liked me, I liked them. We cracked some barristerial jokes. It was all very cool. And I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe I can make it here. And then I got a message, which was that we liked you a lot, and you can definitely come and do the internship, but we're not going to take you on afterwards. We can't give you a job afterwards. And I was like, oh, okay, well, why not? Because that's the whole point of the internship, was that you'd get a job. And they said, well, it's a little delicate. We hope you understand, but we took on a Black guy last year, and we're not going to do it 2 years in a row. We just not what we want to do. And so you can come do the internship. Hopefully you learn a bunch of stuff, but at the end of it, you're going to have to go somewhere else. That's a kink in the hosepipe, my friends. That's what it looks like. And everything's cool, everything's good, it's all great. And then boom, the hose kinks. And I tell you that because I think that a lot of people experience that. It may not be race, it may be gender. And I talk to a lot of people now, over these last 30 years, I've been getting on with life, doing my thing. But in the last 2 or 3 years, I've talked to more and more people, usually people of Black heritage. They kind of, they gravitate towards me, I guess because I'm a Black guy and I've been around for a while. And we have these conversations and they sort of tell me their story. And the story is, I'll give you a couple of stories just to illustrate the kind of things that people will say. So this was a story from a lady called Grace. And Grace basically came to see me for a coffee. I could see she was quite emotional, quite upset about things. And I was kind of, I said, tell me your story, Grace. And she said, okay, so here's the thing. I grew up the child of a single mother, just over there, just over the river. So this is the city of London. And just over there, she said, I used to look across and see the bright, shiny buildings, and I never knew what anybody did in there, but I thought, wow, I could see them buying their, £6 flat whites, and I thought, wow, what must it be like to work there? And she said, it's just me and my mom, and I went to a pretty bad school, but there was a teacher there, and the teacher kind of said, Grace, you're actually pretty bright. You could go far. You could do, I think you could go to university. So she worked hard. She got her maths. She did well, and then she eventually became an actuary. And her big dream was to one day find a job here. And she found a job in the city. And she was, she was in middle management in an asset manager that you will all know. It's a household name. And so I said, well, that all sounds pretty good. What's the problem? And she said, Dawid, now that I'm here, I don't know how to be. Now that I'm here, I don't know how to be. And then she got, I could see she was visibly distressed. And I said, well, give me an example. What does that mean exactly? You don't know how to be. She said, well, I'll give you an example. Just this morning I was in a meeting. It was me and it was 6 guys. And we all represent our little divisions. And she was in Treasury, I think. So she was representing Treasury. And there were these other 6 guys around, all middle-aged white guys. And she said, there's nothing in that particularly. But she said, this topic came up. And I knew the answer. A question came up. It was a pretty important question. I knew the answer. And before I could say it, one of these other guys came in and he gave his answer. And it was the wrong answer. But everyone kind of just took it and went with it. And I knew it was the wrong answer, but somehow I couldn't get my answer out. And then the meeting was over, and it happens every week. And that's what I mean. I don't know how to be. So I said, well, Grace, but why didn't you knew the answer? Why didn't you say it? And she said, I don't know. There was this voice in my ear that was just saying, they're all men. And, I'm the only woman in the room. And I've never really known how to be around men because I didn't have any brothers. My dad was never around. So I'm a bit intimidated when there's 6 men in the room. And somehow I just, and then there was another voice in my ear saying, well, of course, you're a Black as well, right? They're all white. Pretty much they don't really care what you've got to say with these 2 voices. And before I could process it all, the moment had gone, and it just always happens and I don't know how to be. And I walked away from that and I just thought, that's just a terrible, terrible situation, and this is how it was for her every week. And then I realized there are many, many people like that. There are many people in our organizations who don't feel heard, who can't get into the conversation for whatever reason. And the more I talk to it, a lot of women, basically, I tell that story and they're like, yeah, it happened to me all the time. That's the thing. And it can be about race, or it can be about gender, or it can be about the intersectionality where you get both of them together. But that, I think, is something that plays out, and it's, shame on that company that's how it is at that company. All it took would have been taken was for one guy in that room, the leader, to have just said, Grace, this is your area. What do you think about this? And the game would have been different. I didn't have to be that way. And so this is, I think, the story, right? It's not that the organization is essentially racist in the worst sense. It just doesn't care. It doesn't see Grace. She's kind of hidden in plain sight, right? She's in the room, but nobody cares what she's got to say. And she doesn't feel able to get in, and they don't make her feel welcoming. It's this inclusion point where she doesn't feel like she belongs. And she said, I think I'm just going to leave and I'm just going to go and set up a cake shop because I know how to make cakes. And over there, I'll be my own boss. And I thought that is just tragic, right? Here is someone who kills herself to do this stuff. And now here she is. I mean, I could give you more examples. There's some other fabulous examples of people telling me these sorts of things, but I'll leave it there, Lutfey, and then maybe we can get into it as we go.
Thank you very much. That echoes and resonates.
Can I add one thing, Lutfey? So it's interesting, Dawid, what you say. Erica Brodnock here at the Inclusion Initiative led some research that was specific to Black professional women, and exactly what you said came through in that research. Being in the room and not necessarily even being heard when you're actually speaking up. So I think it's a really powerful narrative.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Dawid. Next, it's Ida Liu joining us from San Francisco. very, very early in the morning, interrupting family time, Thanksgiving weekend. Really, really grateful, Ida, for you being here. Ida is global head of the private bank at Citi. She began her career in investment banking and as a fashion executive, then joining Citibank in 2007 to launch a business focused on clients in the fashion, retail, and entertainment practices. She founded Citi Private Bank, North America's Asian client group, and is a member of the Citi Women's Steering Committee. She's amongst Barron's 100 most influential women in US finance, in the top 20 of American bankers' most powerful women in finance, and was recently named co-lead of Citi's Asian Heritage Network. Ida, welcome again. Thank you, and your opening remarks, please.
Lutfey, firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you and of course with the esteemed panelists here as well today. We view diversity and inclusion as a competitive advantage. I think it is a direct correlation, the diversity on our team and the performance that our team generates. We love having an inclusive environment where we have innovative ideas generated from multiple viewpoints, differing backgrounds, and a very global scope. So we've always had that at the heart of what we're doing here at Citi. And I wear a very unique hat, I would say, in that I am looking to not only break the glass ceiling, but I'm also looking to tear down the bamboo ceiling. And sitting in this unique position and looking at both, I can honestly say that we have made a tremendous amount of progress over the last decade on the glass ceiling. In other words, in finance, having Jane Fraser as the CEO of Citi, we've effectively shattered the glass ceiling for women in our institution. Now, flipping over to the other side of it and looking at the bamboo ceiling, being an Asian working in financial services, I must say that we still have a lot of work to do. When you look at the number of Fortune 500 CEOs who are of Asian descent, you can count them on one hand. In other words, it's only a few percent. When you think about the programs that corporate America have put together when we talk about diversity and inclusion, because we believe what gets measured gets done. We have not measured Asians as a group. Why? In the past, because let's face it, it's true. We are often grouped together as the model minority, or frankly, to Dawid's point earlier, the silent minority. And the reality is that when we're talking about Asians in particular and the underrepresentation in corporate America and more broadly, the silent minority and model minority are very, very harmful. We all know that in order to advance in corporate America, you need to have a voice, you need to speak up, you need to advocate for yourself, you are your own best cheerleader. And that is absolutely 100% contrary to the way that we were raised as Asians in the cultural beliefs of being modest, humble, and not touting your accomplishments. So recognizing all of this, we are obviously working to make advancements and to equalize and measure and define progress. And as Lutfey had mentioned, I'm very honored and privileged to also take on the hat as the co-head of our Asian Heritage Network here at Citi, which I am thrilled about because we believe what gets measured gets done. We have a lot of initiatives. We have all of our senior leaders looking at the numbers, and we together are going to continue to move the needle. So thank you for having me, Lutfey.
Thank you very much, Ida. This brings us to Philip Fernandez. Philip, I'm again very grateful to you. You're joining us at now 9:20 p.m. from Singapore and waiting patiently from there. So Philip Fernandez is treasurer and member of the Group Management Committee of DBS. Philip and his team have received numerous awards, such as the Bank Treasurer of the Year at the Asset Asian Awards, IFR Asia Issuer of the Year. He's a fellow at the Singapore Institute of Banking and Finance. Previously, he was head of market risk and has also served as an adjunct associate professor at the Singapore Management University for 6 years. Philip, please set the scene for us with your opening perspectives.
Thanks, Lutfey. I hope you all can hear me clearly.
Yes.
All good?
All
yeah.
good.
So I was really impressed with the stories that Ida, David, and Beatrice had to say. My own journey is somewhat different. I grew up in Singapore. I'm Singaporean, born and bred. And I guess I was fortunate in that the country's always had a certain commitment to multiculturalism. So growing up, I was very fortunate in that sense. And I actually went to university on a scholarship. I mean, I couldn't fund myself, so I got a bursary of sorts from the bank to study at Cambridge. And I was lucky enough to be admitted to King's College. So for those of you who don't know the sort of typology of the Cambridge colleges back in the 80s, and I am that old, you know, they were the preserve of people from certain schools, let's put it that way. And you might get the occasional person from somewhere else, but I certainly did not fit the mold. And later on, I discovered that my college, which I applied to really out of a hat, actually had a very definitive policy for looking in the places that other colleges didn't look. So King's at Cambridge had a very strong commitment to taking candidates from disadvantaged backgrounds who might have struggled to get up. And I guess in that sense, I really benefited from that. And the interesting thing, and the really interesting thing for me was most of the other colleges at that time did not follow this policy, and they went to the traditional schools. And you know, nothing wrong with having gone there, but to take X% from there just implies that you've got some selection bias built in. And as at that time, King's actually used to regularly top the Tompkins table, because they would hunt in all the schools that nobody else was looking in, and they'd get all the top candidates, and they would actually top the table of all the 30 colleges. So the point I'm making is that if you employ diversity and inclusion, it can be a market differentiating strategy. Subsequently, nearly all the Oxbridge colleges have done the same thing. And King's has now moved down the Tompkins table and is maybe somewhere between 6 and 15. It varies each year. So they've gone back to the pack because the diversity benefit that they had has been sort of a strategy that everyone else has followed. So that's one example I would give about how if you build a diverse team, and you know, I agree a lot with what Bea and Ida said, if you can actually build a diverse team, and we do in the bank, I think the outcome you get is just outperformance in a big way. So you have to look past the cultural rough edges. You have to look past the communication stuff. You got to figure out, do you go out and drink tea together? Do you drink beer together or whatever, right? I mean, you've just got to find the ways that people can gel. But I think of it as analogous to, say, since we're all finance folks here, I think of it as analogous to monetary policy. You've got your ultimate targets as a central bank. You know, you're targeting inflation, you're targeting full employment, but you've got proximate targets which lead you to your ultimate targets, right? So you target the interest rate, or you target the FX rate, depending on which part of the trilemma you're playing, in order to get you to your ultimate target. So I think when we look at gender diversity, when we look at race diversity, generational diversity even, those to me are the proximate targets that are very important, and we got to make sure that we don't lose people at that stage. But if we do that right, I'm very convinced that you get to a much better place. I've seen it happen at work. I've seen it happen, you know, at my college, as I was saying. So very happy to support this initiative. At the bank, we're very committed to this. Gender diversity is something we worked on a lot. We're not there, there's still a gap, but a lot of that is women in technology. I think there's a particular gap there that we've not been able to fix, and very interested in people have any thoughts on that. But overall, very committed to this from a personal background as well as a work background, and really look forward to hearing the experiences of other people in the panel and folks on the call.
Thank you, Philip. And that's a great way of framing it, monetary policy with proximate and ultimate targets. And I noted down your point that hopefully we don't lose people along the way as we go from the proximate to the ultimate target. And now to our very own Dr. Grace Lordan. As you know, Grace is the founding director of the Inclusion Initiative, TII, and an associate professor in behavioural science at LSE. She's an expert advisor to the UK government, sitting on their skills and productivity board. She's a prolific writer, not only in academic journals, but also media such as the FT. She's also author of the book, Think Big, Take Small Steps and Build the Future You Want. Hello, Grace.
Hi, Lutfey. Thank you so much. I did an interview. So the Inclusion Initiative, as Lutfey told everyone, is one today. And I did an interview yesterday evening speaking about it. And somebody said to me, did you start with financial and professional services because they're the worst sector when it comes to inclusion? And I honestly said, no, I started because they're the best, because they're having the conversation. They're trying to make the changes. They're setting targets. They're setting quotas. If we look at other industries, technology, Lutfey mentioned government, even academia, we're not having the same conversations that are having within the financial and professional services sector. So I do think that I picked the low-hanging fruit. And I know that because everybody who's on the call today are people who, if I don't know you, I have been a fan of you and a fan of the work that you've actually been doing. So thank you. And thank you for kind of opening the door to having conversations like we're having in the Inclusion Initiative. If I think about the blockades, and again, this will probably be no surprise to the panel, but hopefully a little bit for the audience, I see two. So I think the first is that in many companies, inclusion is still within the human resources function. And that basically means that human resources are seen as the people who should create diversity and inclusion. And depending on the manager who you encounter, they may or may not hold the belief in diversity and inclusion. And I think, the next decade, firms will have a competitive advantage if they move towards bringing it into the business, which I know Siddiqi has done, Ida, actually, even in its markets, bringing it into the business and really embracing the idea of inclusive leadership. So unless you're an inclusive leader and have the tools to be an inclusive leader, then you shouldn't be within that organization. And you can start to see that shift happening anyway within companies, but really moving inclusion into the business because it is a competitive edge, as we've heard from the panel. The second thing that has come up a lot actually is the idea of virtue signaling. And again, I've worked with lots of different companies in London, and if this were off record, I could tell you the ones who are virtue signaling versus the ones that aren't. But virtue signaling is a really dangerous practice where you have senior leaders who talk about diversity and inclusion, but when push comes to shove, the high stakes outcomes, hiring, promotions, pay, they really fall back into the status quo, essentially. And I think when Lutfey and I went to leaders in Singapore to talk about inclusion, two things that were really striking came across from that for me. And I think Anna Lane is on the call. I did see her enter the room, who is the CEO of Women in Banking and Finance. And we had done a project in March that really reveals that what leaders in financial and professional services now want is to move inclusion from what we call the compliance phase, or I've called it the compliance phase, into the culture change phase. So keeping the quotas, keeping the measurement, as Ida pointed out, it's really, really important, but augmenting that with this idea of inclusive leadership that I have just discussed. And this really also came through in Singapore. And what was really special about the Singapore work is that every leader that we met had actually managed global teams. So some had experience in other countries, but they were always managing global teams that often spanned multiple continents. And that really came through in the Singapore as well. This move from, it can't just be about compliance. It can't just be about measurement. There needs to be a movement towards this culture change also. And then the other parts, and I do hope that people will actually go and look at the report, have actually been covered quite well by the panel, and I'm not surprised. So Philip has talked about, cross-cultural understanding, and this really came through in the inclusion framework, that the next wave of leaders in global corporations, like who are represented on the call today, do need to have cross-cultural understanding. They do need to be able to have open conversations with their team, and they do need to be able to understand intersectionality in the way that they haven't in the past. Not because of it being socially responsible, but because for them as a leader, it's absolutely the right thing to do. And I mentioned, the transparent framework that I worked on with Erica Brodnock. And one thing that came through with that is that there are people, and these were the voices of Black professional women, but I've heard this over and over again. There is diversity who are going into companies and they're being forced to adapt and assimilate and play to the strengths of the people who are already in the company. And you're probably losing your competitive advantage if you don't allow people actually be their authentic selves and play to their own strengths when they come into companies. And again, really coming through in the inclusion framework from Singapore, the same message. that we need inclusive leadership who can nurture talent. Special to Singapore was movement away from a command and control style leader where they are the decision maker, the person needs to agree with everything they say, and embracing this idea of what we call a humble leader, where their job is to bring everybody in the team along. And when they're bringing everybody in the team along, being challenged is part of that. And when they're being challenged, to open their minds that actually the team members are acting in their best interest as the leader. So kind of this change from the person who's at the top of the room being in charge to somebody who can bring all voices along. And I think this really speaks to Ida, what Ida said about cultural differences and what silence means. I think it also speaks to, you know, this kind of anglicized idea about what it means to do well in a global corporation, is that you can speak very loudly for yourself. And, you know, you can hold a room where you're not necessarily interrupted. Another thing, again, that we have to work on when it comes to inclusion is active listening. So if you have all these people who are trying to speak within a meeting and get the attention of the leader, they're probably not listening to their team members. And again, that competitive edge that we could have from having diverse people listen to each other, create, innovate, and assess risk goes away. And that's it, Lutfey. That's the summary of our, if I've left anything out, please do let me know. I'm back to you.
Thank you, Grace. There is a lot in the framework, and I'm hoping that by the time we're done, people will have memorized what INCLUSION stand for, because it really is a very useful way of framing it. Questions are coming into the Q&A box, so I might go to that shortly. But before I do that, and I was going to address this to one of the panelists, but I'm going to now open it up to whoever wishes to answer it. But it'll take me a minute or so to ask the question. And this is around numerical quota versus changing the culture so that it happens organically. Does one help the other? Does having numerical targets, quotas, usher along real change? Does it help people hold themselves accountable, hold each other accountable? Or does it create a cosmetic fig leaf that suppresses real inclusion? And this has come up in tremendous detail in some of these closed door conversations that we've had. It links with this idea of tokenism, the virtue signaling that Grace just mentioned. Are you being authentic, or are you ticking a box because there is a box to be ticked? I'll give you an extreme set of examples. In Singapore, the Monetary Authority of Singapore has a 28-member international advisory panel. They have 0 women on that. The governing board has 1 woman. GIC has 18 members on the governing board, 0 women on that. Temasek has 0 women on the board now, I believe. And their argument is, look, rather than parachute in somebody from outside, we're really bolstering the leadership team. And when you then look at the executive leadership team, it actually does look a lot more inclusive. So the argument seems to be that we will organically get there. Whereas if we parachute people in who may be perceived not to be qualified, then why do we do that? The other side of the argument is that you get proper gender parity when you have as many incompetent women in positions of authority as you have men, right? So why should that be? So that is the broad way I've positioned this. Who would like to take this question? Quota versus not. Grace, can I come to you last so that you don't cede this conversation, this particular thread? I'll come to Grace last if somebody else would like to take that.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in if I may. I think that it really has to be a combination of both. Okay, so we truly believe, as I mentioned earlier, that what gets measured gets done. So each of our leaders across our city businesses are held accountable for measurement. And I think it is very important that we do that to continue to move the needle. But at the same time, when you think about the importance of getting the right representation, it doesn't happen overnight. So we have to think about everything. And I know Grace mentioned this earlier about how some institutions really view this as a human resources related strategy. It's not. It's a business-led in combination, in partnership with human resources to achieve the right goals and objectives. But that starts at the beginning when we hire into the organizations to make sure that we're getting the right representation straight out when we're hiring new analysts and new individuals to join our organization. But equally important, we have to have a diverse interviewer slate to make sure that the folks that are interviewing with us as an organization recognize that we are a diverse organization and that we do value and respect and encourage a diverse and inclusive organization. So it's both ways: diverse interviewer slates, diverse interviewee slates, starting at the beginning as a very important starting point, and then also measuring all of our leaders across the organization on the progress that we're all making. I think it's a given at the Citi culture that it is something that we care deeply about as an organization. So it's not this inauthentic, so to speak. We understand the competitive edge that comes from having a diverse and inclusive culture and environment. Look at our board, we're 50% women. We have a woman leading Citi, and we have a very diverse executive management team here at Citi as well. So we're making the right steps, but obviously still work to be done.
Thank you. Anyone else? Dawid?
Maybe I could jump in as well and just add to that. I mean, I'm a big believer in what gets measured gets managed. Totally. This is true of everything from climate. We measure the temperature because we want to know where it is. It's true of just literally every aspect of life. You don't measure it, you tend not to manage it. It can be your personal weight, it can be your, the time it takes you to run around the park. You measure the stuff and then you improve. I think, I see the objection that you raised, Lutfey, that you put up there as a straw objection, if you like. And it's, for me, it's one of several cards that the system puts in place. The system plays. It's like a card game, right? So if you go to someone who's running an organization with 18 men on the board, and you say, look, this doesn't look good, he will typically play a bunch of cards. He's got 5 or 6 cards in front of him. And one card will be, and this is true about race, it's true about gender, but it's a game in effect. And the game will be, card number 1 will be something like, look, we don't really have the data and we need to measure it. And until we have the data, this is classically in the race space, this is a classic card that gets played. We don't have the data. So I see what you say, but without the data, what am I supposed to do? Would be card number 1. Card number 2 will be, look, we're on the case. We're trying, right? We've put some stuff in place, and we've told HR that we want to fix this thing, and it takes time, right? So that's card number 2. Card number 3 is, look, this is really, really complicated. It's a wicked problem. You can't expect something overnight. This is just, it's going to fix itself in due course. I promise you, we're on the case. Card number 4 is, what happens if we hire a bunch of incompetent women or incompetent Black people? Then we'll just end up with lots of incompetent people. Card number 5 is, well, quotas, who wants to talk about quotas? Quotas are not a good thing. You end up, and on and on and on the card game goes. And guess what? You still end up with 18 men on the board, or you still end up with 18 white guys, or whatever it is. It's a card game, basically. And I think you have to call it out, and you have to say, we've tried this stuff. We've tried the waiting game. We've sat around and we've watched your strategy of watching it organically fix itself. And guess what, guys? It hasn't worked. So how about now we start measuring it? We know what good looks like. And let's actually, maybe we even start linking your compensation to the outcome. Because I'll say this, I think that the last 2 decades have been what you might call the decades of the machine, the time of the machine, by which I mean this bad boy right here, right? Figuring this thing out as he changes the world. But now this decade is around culture. This decade is around getting the firms that we set up to be inclusive. And if we don't get that, and if you're running an organization with 18 men who run the entire place, or whatever the stat was that you put out there, then basically your time is up, right? You have like maybe a couple of years, 2-3 years, you're going to get blown away, right? You're done. It's not going to work. You're going to be like Kodak. You're going to be like Blockbuster. You're going to be like any of those other guys who, basically didn't realize that the cheese was moving. So
good to see that I've got the passion coming out. That was the whole goal of putting a straw man out there. So anyone else before I come to Grace? Philip.
Yeah, Lutfey. So, very good question, and I think that's something we need to think about. The point I'd make, and not necessarily referring to any particular organization, is what gets measured gets managed. So I'm with David on that. I do run on the park and I do measure it, but it doesn't seem to get any better. So that's perhaps in a different category. The key thing though is, are we making progress? I think if you set a number and you get fixated on it's got to be 50% or it's got to be 60 or whatever, that's when it starts to skew off. But if you are better this year than last year, and every 6 months, or every year, you can demonstrate measurable progress, then I think you're moving in the right direction. So I wouldn't go so much in the direction of quotas, but it go in the direction of measuring things, definitely, and saying, have you made progress? If that number is 0 year after year, then clearly, like what David says, I think we're not making progress. And we have to measure the progress over meaningful time intervals, obviously not 3 months and not 3 years or 5 years, somewhere in between, and just say year by year, are you making progress in a direction? So that's what we've done, for example, in the gender space within the bank, and we've closed gaps, and we've done some things, and we've figured out where exactly the gaps come from. And if we need to be more targeted about closing the gaps in particular areas, I mentioned technology, for example, that's something that we're really very actively looking at and seeing what we can actually do about. So I'd go a little away from quotas, but more towards measurement and setting targets for improvement. So that's the slight nuance.
Bea and then Grace.
Okay, perfect. So look, I mean, most of what is important has been said. I think the data availability to make improvements on the diversity and inclusion is very important. And I think by now, probably all our peers have had that. On quotas, I mean, you know, I've been somebody that have changed her mind, in this case, my mind about quotas, right? I think as a young, you know, professional, and somebody that I said, I never felt like a diverse employee in any ways. I always thought I'm totally part of the crowd. It was really difficult for me to admit that at times, not everybody feels like that. And some of the examples that you guys have been bringing up here today is clear that, you know, everybody, this is a very personal, you know, matter, right? How people behave, how much do they speak up, how much do they want to be in the, you know, out there being seen as somebody that is vocal about certain things. Is that good for my career, bad for my career, depending on the background you have, and whether, you know, from a cultural point of view, you will feel like you can contribute and therefore, you know, be part of the team is different for everybody. And, you know, the comments about training managers to be inclusive, to ask the question about, Bea, what do you think about this? This is your area of expertise. I think is a very, very important part. So for us here at UBS, I mean, we've been giving managers targets to improve, precisely what Philip was describing, but these are very clear improvements on the current data. We are giving them data on a regular basis so they can manage that and improve that, and we hold them to account for that. But at the same time, I think the educational part of it is a very important one. The cultural, you know, kind of evolution is very important, because it's not up to me as the, you know, UK chief exec to, you know, just move my magic wand and make it happen. It's up to everybody that hires, pays, promotes, you know, and to make the difference and think hard whether there is any diverse candidate that could be, you know, the one that could take the next role. So it is about, you know, everybody, and the cultural part of it has to change.
Thank you. Grace, finally, I'm sorry to come to you.
Good. I mean, a lot of what I wanted to say was covered. I mean, I just want to say two short things. I think on quotas, people either always like quotas or dislike quotas. Obviously, if we had cultural change and we had representation that happened mechanically, that would be better. And I think in the absence of that, having a quota is a really good thing. So if I'm a woman and I'm hired onto a panel, because I'm a quota, the chances of my voice being diminished are higher, right? So people are less likely to listen to me. Those 18 people who you spoke about are probably likely to discount my opinion. And then it comes down to whether or not I'm tenacious enough to withstand that, keep talking, keep getting my views across, be a really good role model for the people in the company, and bring other people who are below me along. And that's how I feel about tokens. People always say, do you like or dislike tokens? And I say, who is the token? So if the token is going to be somebody who's going to adapt, sit with the 18 people, agree with them, then, you know, it's pointless having a woman sitting at that table or another underrepresented person. However, if you have somebody who's going to go in, have the hard conversations, keep talking, you know, really bring along progress, a token can be a wonderful thing for a company that's not doing anything else at this particular moment in time. So if they told me the token was you, Lutfey, I would be very, very happy, because I know the progress would actually be made, for example. But if they told me that it was somebody who was, you know, on the golf trips, you know, out having dinner, regardless of their diversity in appearance, I wouldn't be that satisfied with it. So again, I don't think we should think of these things as all or nothing. We should ask who's filling the quotas and who is the token.
Absolutely. So it's a false binary, and as you say all the time, context matters.
Yes.
Situations. Looking at the Q&A box to see if we could take some questions from there. There's a question from Dr. Jasmine Viria of the TII, and the question is for Ida. How do you think South Asians can assist East Asians in breaking the bamboo ceiling?
That's actually an excellent question, and I'm really delighted that you brought that up, because when I alluded to the fact that there are only a few percent CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who are Asian, all of those happen to be South Asians versus the East Asians. So there are some nuances even between and within our AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander group. So when you look at that and you look at generally, now I'm overgeneralizing here, the differences and the nuances between the East and South Asians is that, again, a lot of that is somewhat cultural. And as I alluded to earlier, the East Asians are often taught to be quiet, put your head down, work hard, and assume that good things will happen. You'll get tapped on the shoulder for the next promotion, which we all know just doesn't simply happen. So I think it is about a couple of different things, awareness of the cultural differences. I think awareness of the cultural differences for all the different individuals, right? We're not just talking about East and South Asians here, but just awareness in general about some of the cultural nuances with differing employees. I think secondly, one of the things about that stereotype of silent minority, I just wanted to share a brief story with you all that I was exactly that stereotype when I was growing up. I was the quiet student that worked hard. I never spoke up. I was scared to speak publicly. I was actually petrified of public speaking. And a speech teacher in high school changed my life because she forced me out of my comfort zone to speak up, have a voice, and advocate for myself. And she changed my life forever. I would not be in the seat I am today had it not been for her and her willingness to push me above and beyond my comfort zone to help me find a voice to be able to advocate for myself. And so when I think about my personal journey and I recognize the importance of that voice at the table, you're at the table for a reason. You have to be vocal. You have to use that voice. And oftentimes, frankly speaking, the East Asian population just does not, right? Because we're scared to, or we're more reserved, or we just want to do our job really well and get recognized for it. And so those are some of the nuances that we've seen and that we're trying to coach, because boy, do we have a lot of Asians in middle management. But when you look at the senior ranks in the EMT, that drops off dramatically, as you've seen. All of us on this call have seen. So what are the things that we need to do knowing this to prepare, to arm, to train, to develop the middle management to help them break through the ceiling? So those are the things that we are looking at extensively in programs that we're putting together to help.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ida. Dawid, there's a question for you from Charles Sherwood. Dawid, you once said to me, having different genders and skin colors in the same room does not necessarily give you diversity. What did you really see as the essence of diversity?
That's a great question, and yeah, glad to see Charles is on the call. Great friend of mine. So, look, I mean, I think, like I said, this is a wicked problem, and I think a lot of organizations don't really understand what they're trying to solve, right? When it comes to generating profits, or it comes to running their asset liability division better, they understand, they've done that. But this is kind of snuck up a little bit on a lot of leadership, and they don't really get it. So for them, as long as they see more brown people wandering around, or they have one black person now in some position of semi-leadership, well, then they feel like they've ticked the box. But my point is that doesn't cut it, right? This is a cultural rewiring. You've got to think completely differently, and you've got to envisage a world where all of your norms are turned on their head. So, like I was just saying, we all take our pictures now on this, right? We don't use, none of us uses cameras with film in it anymore, but if you'd gone to Kodak 20 years ago or 30 years ago, whenever it was, and you'd said, you know, what does the future look like? For them, it was more glossy film, or it was getting more pictures on a roll of film, or it was whatever it was, but they never saw this coming, right? And I think it's the same with culture. I think a lot of the organizations right now that are looking at this don't really understand the seismic shift that is required, partly because I don't think they understand the way the next generation thinks. People like my daughter, who's 26, and my sons, who are 29 and 22, they think fundamentally differently to the way people of my generation think. I don't like unfairness. I hate it. But my kids see it on a different level altogether, right? They are made visceral. It is visceral for them. They kind of throw up when they see unfairness across every vertical. And that's coming through, right? You know, they're going to be, in 10 years' time, they're going to be running these organizations. And we can either get ready for that and make sure that the handover and the transition is smooth, or we can, you know, or we cannot. So I think it's about understanding it. And I'll just give you one very quick example, if I may rattle through this. So I talked about Grace, who was invisible in, you know, not visible in plain sight. But then this is a story about Josie. And Josie was talking to me. She's a lawyer. She's smart. She's young. She's Black. And she was taken on by a Magic Circle firm 2 or 3 years ago. And they solicited her. They brought her in, and they paid her pretty well. And at the same time, they brought in a couple of other guys who were more what you might call usual suspects. I think one had been to Cambridge, one had been to Harvard. Very kind of usual suspect, as you might expect into a Magic Circle firm. And Josie was saying to me that it was kind of strange because she was working hard and she was being paid well. And then she discovered that one of these guys, maybe both of them, let's call one of them Jake, was just moving faster than she was, got promoted a bit quicker, got paid a bit more. It's like the travelator at the airport, where one is just moving ahead. And no matter what she did, this guy was just kind of taking off. And then he got promoted, and he was kind of way out in front of her. And she said the light came on when she was at a dinner listening to the senior partner of the firm talking. And she realized he was talking about Jake. And he was talking about him like he was his father and like Jake was his son. There was a kind of paternalism about him, and he'd broken off a bit of his practice, and he kind of got him ready for promotion, and he'd shown him how to be in meetings and told him what to work on and taken him into a government discussion. He was literally shepherding this guy through to greatness. He'd obviously looked at him, and at one point the senior partner said, "He reminds me of myself." And she said, "It's interesting. There's no one in the firm who looks at me and thinks she reminds me of myself. First of all, I'm a woman, and there are no women at the top. Secondly, I'm Black. There's no one Black in the firm. And the fact is, no one was looking at her, shepherding her, or guiding her." And the more I thought about it, it kind of reminded me of this idea of marginal gains, which is this idea that you just do a few things slightly better than everyone else, and then you win the game, right? Whether it's it doesn't matter whether it's cycling or competition, whatever it is, you do everything a little bit better, it all starts to add up. And I was thinking what Josie had there, or didn't have rather, what Jake had, were marginal gains, right? The senior partner was just benefiting him with these little marginal gains across his career, and it was all kind of adding up, and he was just moving faster. And I think that's what we do in our systems and in our organizations. So to Charles's point, it's not just about who you hire in and having a few more, a few more people who look a bit different. It's a much bigger gig about looking at the Josies of this world and about taking her through the organization and about working out who you're going to bring in, not just usual suspects and then kind of drop them in and just kind of leave them there. So, I'll pause there.
Thank you, Dawid. Next question is from Asha Raza Durai, postgraduate student, LSE Behavioral Science. What about ageism, discrimination against people 50 not being taken seriously? Is that an issue in the industry, in this industry?
I'll just jump in super quick. It's definitely an issue, no doubt about it. And look, although I look at things often through a race lens, because of my heritage, I'm half Black, half white. The reality is I'm really concerned about across the piece. So, I'll just say, yes, it's absolutely an issue. There are a lot of people in their 50s and 60s. I run a few conferences, and last week I ran a conference. There were about 50. They were all men. They were all in their early 60s. And when you talk to them, there's real trauma as they realize that they haven't figured out what comes next. I think there's a real generation there, and we definitely need to be thinking about that totally.
I think the other way around as well, Lutfey, the idea that somebody who is south of 50 can't be on a board or can't be kind of in senior management is still really prevailing in financial professional services sector, while the sector is actually getting, revolutionized with technology, where younger people generally have a comparative advantage given how fast technology is moving as they're coming out of university. So I think the generations is, again, next to some other topics like disability, one that's spoken about too little. And I think the question specifically asks about initiatives against ageism. And I don't know any company that is tackling generations in a way that we're looking at gender, in the way that we're looking at ethnicity, in the way that we're looking at underrepresentation. But I agree that I think it's going to be a topic for the future.
That's right. I guess bias is bias, whichever way you cut it. And lack of inclusion is lack of inclusion. So if there is a way to frame or nurture an organization culture that takes it at the level of bias and at the level of inclusion without talking necessarily about categories of people, then maybe that would be more impactful. Question from Tess Kurian. This is something that Philip mentioned when it comes to the fact that King's College hunted in schools that others were not doing. The questioner seems to be saying that it's kind of easy to accept qualified candidates when they are qualified, but how about those that may not be there with their level of education? So equity, access of the right kind of education. Is there something, maybe Grace, do you want to take that can be done to make sure that inclusion starts even before we hire?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, universities in general have a really big responsibility to think about their scholarship programs and what they're offering to people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to take down the financial barriers to go for university. I think that needs to go beyond just paying for the ticket to university and actually giving these kids who have skills, talent, and ability in equal measures to the other kids who are going in to university, access to monies that will allow them not have to work part-time, not have to work during the summer, so they can have exactly the same experience interning like other students. And I'm really proud to say the first type of program like this has come to the LSE, thanks to Lance Ugla, one of our alumni. I am the Scholars Mentors, and this scholarship program offers exactly what I just described. It's not just about the ticket price into university, it's bringing skills, talented, and kids who are extraordinarily able into the LSE and giving them the exact same experience as their peers. And I think that's really important. I think the other thing that's important, and Philip has mentioned this, is the pipeline problem. So, STEM still does have a pipeline problem with too few women, for example, choosing to study the STEM subjects as compared to men. I think downstream, we really need to talk to kids about their opportunities from as early as, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, normalizing being an engineer as well as a nurse if you're a girl, and normalizing being a nurse as well as an engineer if you're a boy, so that by the time we meet them at 15, 16, 17, and they're making their choices, they don't have entrenched social norms. And I think what's really interesting is most countries in the world have these entrenched social norms if we compare boys to girls, and they do come about as the kids are growing. So it's something about the societies that they're actually growing up in. So again, I think downstream, really good education programs on careers that opens up options that aren't biased in any direction is well worth investing in.
And Bear, I think UBS has an apprenticeship program, and there's further education colleges that you guys go to outside.
We do. Yeah, so UBS actually has the Bridge Academy, which is a school where we actually, support a very deprived area, very near to our office, in fact, in Shoreditch, but, from a social economic background, so deprived or social economic background. And we have been very passionate about that. For us, it's a great opportunity to get our employees engaged. We have the governors of the school. We do quite a lot of tutoring in the mornings in this building before, now with COVID less so. But if you can play piano, if you're good at maths, or if you are brilliant in English, then you can support the kids throughout that time. We talk about career prospects. We take them here as well for a 6 weeks kind of internship time when they are around 14, so that they can see what we do and they get familiar with what the bank is doing. Is definitely something that we support very strongly, and I think for us a very, very important part of what we do here in the UK. And the apprenticeship program, of course, thanks to the government support, by the way, with the apprenticeship levy, this has been a huge success for us. And, again, has brought us to maybe a, age bracket that we were not used to as well, very different ideas and perspectives from those employees as well. And frankly, our experience has been excellent over the last years that we've been doing it. So
are they going into permanent jobs? And
yes, they are going into permanent jobs. When they are in the apprenticeship program, they need to deserve some time to, learning as well and developing their skills. We also offer internally some of the courses on, Coursera and, coding and more IT type of skill sets, obviously. But, definitely most of them stay as permanent employees after the apprenticeship program. Yes. Some of them go to university, though. They change their mind later, which is also not bad. And we try to support them to that as well. So
I see two more questions, one from Arun, one from Elizabeth. So Arun's question, maybe I'll direct it to Ida, if I may. So he's saying that currently we have limited gender representation in key decision-making roles in climate finance. Women only make up 19% of both the IMF and World Bank boards, he says. Given our urgent need for cognitive diversity to address climate change challenges, what steps can our financial services industry take to address this imperative situation?
That's a great question, and I think very relevant given the COP26 discussions that we've all seen over the last couple of weeks. So it is absolutely imperative and critical that we all do our part as it pertains to the E, the S, and the G. And here we're talking about the E. And as you've probably seen from us at LSETII, on Jane's first day on the job, she announced that LSETII would do its part to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. I think what is very evident from the COP26 conversations is that leadership in the financial services space has been quite outstanding in terms of what we are committing to as a group to make sure we are doing our part to improve the environmental aspects of our footprint around the world. In terms of gender representation as it pertains to the initiatives and efforts here, I don't think it's any different from gender representation in any other aspect of what we've been talking about, in that we definitely need more gender representation and more diverse opinions and perspectives. So we're all going to be focused on that. And I think that the most evident picture was when they had the photo of all the world leaders at COP26, and there were only a few, unfortunately, women represented there, right? So clearly work to be done there too, but suffice to say that we are very pleased at LSETII, and I know that Bea and others and the organizations around the world, that we're all focused on this as a front and center plate of what we're doing, not only because it's a must do, but also because our clients expect that and demand that from the financial services organizations as well.
Thank you. Ida, the next question is from Elizabeth Steeman. I will read out the question, see whoever wishes to answer that. Elizabeth is a member of LSE Council. Question is, how forceful should clients be when they're faced with a non-diverse team that has come to them for business? So she says, I've been involved in a few M&A transactions, and these investment banks and law firms, they would send a team of advisors, very non-diverse. I had hoped that times had moved on, but they clearly haven't. How forceful should clients be in those situations?
Oh, I'll give it a try then. So look, very forceful. And we have, in fact, been getting some feedback from clients that they would like to see more diverse teams in the pitching teams when we go and do M&A, or when we see clients. I do believe that, particularly, and I'm sure Ida will be able to comment, particularly in the private banking space, I think clients expect, to see somebody that thinks like them, looks like them, have similar, needs or understanding, and those when you see people, I think what David was describing before, I can see myself in you. That's why I kind of almost sponsor you through your career, right? Those types of emotional kind of bindings also happen with clients, right? And so I think clients do demand people that look like them or that understand their background or are similar to them. And as banks, I think we ought to offer them that, right?
If I could just add on to that, Lutfey, one of the client meetings that I had recently, the client commented to me that I really appreciate that your team resembles the United Nations. And I took that as a massive compliment. And that, I believe, as I mentioned at the very onset of this conversation, is our competitive differentiator. It's our talent, it's our diversity, it's our inclusiveness. And we have to mirror the clients that we serve, to Bea's point. And in particular, in private banking, you have to remember that women are going to control 30 trillion of wealth over the next decade. And you have to understand that, there is a huge opportunity where if we have the right approach with the right team, with the right diversity represented there's no question we're going to do better, and we're going to continue to outperform in that aspect.
I think if I could add, Lutfey, and thank you, Elizabeth, for the question, who I know and I like very much. I absolutely agree with the panel. I mean, supply chain management is one of the best tools for diversity and inclusion. And I think if companies are saying within their walls that they care about diversity and inclusion, they should be managing their supply chain and asking questions about their suppliers and changing suppliers if the supplier isn't actually keeping up with the times, So I think it can not only hurt the company with respect to competitive advantage, but there is reputation damage for engaging with companies who stubbornly refuse to address diversity and inclusion problems when we know that it is actually a competitive advantage. So I echo the comments that it should be very strongly sent back to the homogeneous team.
I think it goes even further than that, because sometimes you would have, let's say, a model minority person on the team. And to Ida's point earlier on, that person might be quiet. That's the analyst who sits in the corner and does the numbers. And I think as a client, you can actually bring that person out of the shell, show that you value their contribution in the meeting. And that alone, that signal will actually tell the boss or whoever's leading the meeting that, hey, we value these people. They bring something to the table. And that would speak even more to my mind, that every time you have a conversation, you try and draw these quiet people in the room, whether you're on the client side or internal meetings. If you follow that same principle, I think it basically helps get to a better outcome.
And I think, Lutfey, just if I could jump in, and I know time's marching, but I would just say that I think it's worth remembering that this conversation is all within the context of ESG, right? And we take the E very seriously. Our good friend Rob Gardner, I was just telling you about, he's just replaced 4 huge managers, managers managing a huge amount of money at St. James's Place, and he just switched them basically. Why? Because they didn't have a sensible story in the E space, right? When he asked them, "What are you doing on climate?" they just kind of mumbled. So he said, "Okay, you're not the future. You're not the future. You're not the future. You're not the future. You're all out." These are like big guys. He replaced them all, and that's a wake-up call for them, right? Next time they'll have a story. And this is the S in ESG. This is the social piece that a lot of organizations think is an optional extra. It's not. And you're going to find out, is my point, that if you don't have your G and you don't have your E, okay, you're going to be in trouble. The time is, the door is now, right? The S is just as important, and you need to have, this is not just about, so you do send a very strong signal back, which is this isn't good enough. Next time you send a team, don't let it look like this. And by the way, diversity is not just about gender, right? It's about more than that. It's about, I think that's the other problem. A lot of organizations think, well, provided we put like 3 women on a team of 6, well, we've ticked that box. Well, not necessarily. It depends who's asking the question, right? So it's complex.
I want to say one thing and maybe give a shout out to all, men allies as well, because I know we always speak about, gender diversity, ethnic diversity, in whatever form, social background, all of that. But, at the end of the day, I do think that you do not have to be any of those things in order to be diverse and inclusive, right? And that is a very, very important point for me, because, we do have a lot of people that take this agenda extremely seriously. We do have a lot of men that are extremely important allies, vital allies for all of us to, execute on this agenda, to continue, the progress that we've done. And the danger is that they feel disengaged in this, in this journey. And that for me is something that we can't allow to happen, right? So to all of those, I think it's really important to say thank you so much for everything you do at UBS, for my ones at least, but in general in the industry, I can see that a lot. And I'm super grateful that we can count on non-diverse in any way. Everybody's diverse in some sort of way, right? We are all unique. So that's the way I kind of think about it.
Excellent.
I have to say that I completely agree with Bea, and I must say that allyship is one of the most important things to advancing diversity and inclusion, because we can't just be a group of women in the room advocating for women. We need our men to support and partner with us as well, and likewise for all of the other groups too, right? In thinking about that. So Bea, absolutely spot on. Allyship is so incredibly important. That's why when we look at our affinity networks at LSETII, we usually have a man and a woman leading, LSETII Women, for example, and I couldn't agree more. So I just wanted to mention that.
Wonderful.
These are the inclusive leaders, Lutfey. So I feel we are full circle, right? So these are the leaders who bring voices to the table, who, as Philip said, if there's somebody in the room who isn't participating, that they're actually bringing them in, and who are managing supply chains and asking questions about diversity that goes beyond gender. And there are lots of men who are practicing that, and ultimately I think that's what we need to be looking for. Who are the people who are the inclusive leaders in organizations?
Right. There's a very long question which I will try and stylize and actually just add to that on my own, and I'm going to say it very slowly so it gives you a bit of time to think of the answer. So cast your mind back to your own careers and think of two situations. One in which someone you worked with had an unconscious bias about you, and they changed. So what was that? And then flip it around. Think of a situation where you had an unconscious bias about somebody else. What was it, and how did you realize it and changed that? Who would like to go first?
I'll jump in.
Okay.
And I'll just talk about, this is quite a recent thing for me, but I was mentioning earlier that I run a couple of conferences, and as such, we have speakers who come and talk. And one of the people who came to talk has been, I've gotten to know her pretty well now, is a trans woman by the name of Paris Lees. And if you'd asked me about a year ago what I knew about the trans community, I literally knew virtually nothing apart from what I read in the media. But now I've become quite good friends with with Paris and with trans people, maybe 3 or 4. And I've gotten to understand their journey, and it's been transformational. I mean, I understand that community in a way that is just completely rewritten, not so much my unconscious biases, but I had a set of beliefs and narratives in my head, which I've completely rewritten now. And I have to say that it just came from hearing, Paris's story and hearing other people's stories. And, I have a godson who's going through that whole journey now, and hearing his story. And it's a big, I think a lot of it is about hearing other people. So yeah, I've definitely been through that. And I would say where I am now, just in the trans discussion, is a big lesson to me that, I had all these narratives. I thought I kind of understood it, but I didn't, is the truth. And I think that's true for a lot of different, areas where I don't know nothing about it, but I kind of feel like, yeah, I'm sure I know, I've read a bit about it. So, how hard can it be? Not until you hear people talk about it and you really get involved and you think, I need to get involved in this. I need to understand it. I need to immerse myself in this. You suddenly find, I didn't understand it at all.
Thank you, Dawid. Anyone else?
I can go. So I think for me, Lutfey, and it actually has come up a couple of times in the conversation today. I was at one stage in my career where I was in a meeting and a colleague never spoke during the entire meeting. And I remember being at like a social gathering, and I said to her, why are you just so disengaged in the meeting? And she, this is kind of at the start of my career. And she said to me, I've been here for 8 years before you, and every time I speak, nobody listens to me. So it's, people talk over me. My points are never taken in the meeting. So it's actually rational for me to stop speaking. And up to that point, I really thought that she was just disengaged, but this was actually somebody who rationally thought, what's the point in actually speaking in that meeting if nobody is actually going to talk to her? At the same time, I actually had an ally who was at the where I was at the time. And I mentioned it to him, actually, speaking about male allies, that this was actually happening to her within the meeting. And he began to pave the way for her to kind of speak again. But had I not had that conversation and questioned why she were disengaged in that moment, I never would have actually learned that it was more about the culture in that meeting, which I will actually say I was ignorant of, but once she pointed it out to me, I could see it. And it was kind of a self-defense mechanism for her and kind of a rational action, in the word of economists, rather than somebody who didn't actually want to show up at work. And it kind of now, since then, anyone who doesn't speak at meetings, I not only ask them about it, like, is it your choice, or is there kind of something that I can do to enable that? But I don't rush to the conclusion that this is just a disengaged employee. I actually give the benefit of the doubt to somebody who's taken their voice away, which I think is really important given what we're talking about today.
Thank you, Grace. So I'll move on. And if people would like to answer the question later, you're welcome to do so. I want to go back to this framework that we spoke about at the start, which is neatly summarized in this inclusion acronym, INCLUSION. And if I could take maybe 2 minutes to just very quickly rattle through what each of these is supposed to mean and see if it triggers something in people's minds, either people who want to ask questions about them or any of the panelists who may want to bring them up. But it resonates, I think you will find, with many of the things that have been discussed so far. So here goes. The I of inclusion is for inclusive leadership. And this is the most important point, I think, that's come out today, which is that inclusive leadership is a thing in its own right. It isn't other types of leadership, it's inclusive leadership. So we train for inclusive leadership. When we get promoted because of our technical prowess, we need to be able to provide it with training in inclusive leadership. And that's all the way down from how to conduct meetings to being mindful of some of the cultural nuances and so on. In the report, you'll find some amazing quotes from people that have brought out instances where they felt that I wish the leader had done something marginally different. It would have had a compounded effect, positive effect on the outcome. The N is norms in hiring. So this is a manifestation of biases that can happen at hiring, pre-hiring, during hiring, appraising, and how we reward and promote people. And there are ways of just being aware of the most common biases that we are prone to, and to design processes so that we don't fall prey to the biases that we know exist in those situations. C is the cross-cultural layer, and many of the examples we have and the quotes we have are the New York Asia nexus, New York, Hong Kong, New York, Singapore. There seems to be an assumption in the global hubs that there is only one way of doing things, that the fact that silence can mean different things in different culture. You could be sitting in a risk committee meeting and someone doesn't voice out a concern, doesn't mean he or she agrees that there is no risk here. That cultural layer is extremely important and perhaps is underappreciated. And in the context of Singapore, the role of cultural intermediaries came out quite a bit, that you often need people in between who are mediating between cultures. What comes after C? It's L. So L stands for long-term perspective. And this is an acknowledgement that there are sometimes short-term trade-offs and costs involved in pursuing diversity and inclusion. Having a diverse slate of potential interviewees may take longer, maybe more of a hassle. Do you have a quarterly P&L target to meet? What's the exchange rate between the two? Does the organization culture understand and appreciate that this is a long-term game and that you should not succumb to the short-term trade-offs? So after L, it's U. U stands for understanding the benefits. They sound a bit like Peppa Pig, which has been in the press recently. Understanding the benefits of inclusion. This has come up a lot, which is that people assume that the point that Ida made, that we regard it as a competitive advantage, is not necessarily shared or well understood. People don't at times genuinely feel enthused and motivated by the benefits of inclusion. So talking about the intrinsic value of inclusion, that's one. Otherwise, people would treat it as a compliance thing, which can then breed apathy. Next is S, and S stands for salient, making salient your impact of inclusion that you're pursuing in your business, the impact you're having in the supply chain with your clients, with the society at large, the ecosystem as a whole. This going beyond the firm and making salient the impact on society and the supply chain seems to be very important, particularly lower down the hierarchy. I stands for incentives. Are the incentives aligned and are they consistent with what you're trying to achieve? So is there alignment between words, tone, and deeds? What comes after I? O stands for opportunities. So this is about access. How do you as leaders make access available to people, opportunities available to people? Is it just easy to give the promotion to whoever asks for it the loudest? Or do you really catch yourself to not fall for that sort of easy ways around it? So are the entry doors to opportunities too narrow? Structurally, can we design processes so that opportunities are more equal? And then the last is N. And what does N stand for? Any guesses, anyone? N stands for narratives. And this is about, are you telling the stories? Are we framing the narrative in a way that moves people towards inclusion? The personal stories, some of which that I heard today, I wish people heard more of those in the company town halls, in the various meetings, where the objective is inspiration, where the objective is to move people emotionally towards it, where the stories of inclusion or the stories of lack of inclusion and the outcomes that they have resulted in. Are we telling the stories, engaging in the narratives in an authentic way, or is it prepackaged PR, comms, and therefore not really having an impact? So that is your inclusion acronym. I will stop here.
If I may say so, thank you, Lutfey. I thought it's really good acronym. Actually, I think it probably touches everything that we've been talking about today. For me, the opportunities and the access available is one where you touch a lot of, the hiring, the promotion, the sponsorship, the pipeline, the plans, the strategic, growth and improvement on the metrics and the data. That is a very important one. All of them are really very important, but for me, the opportunity is the one where, we need to focus more on somehow.
Right. Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah,
Grace, would you like to?
The acronyms are incredibly important and spot on. I think we've all discussed them throughout the conversation today. The last point you touched on, the narrative, I think it's absolutely true, Lutfey, that seeing is believing. And the more that we increase the representation, the more that people will believe it's possible, the more that people will see that we're moving in the right direction. So to your point, that narrative, the storytelling, and what people see is incredibly important, because you can do a lot of talking, but if it's not happening, you're not going to make the progress.
That's right. Grace?
I would go for the leadership piece. Sorry, Grace.
Philip, you go.
Oh, thank you. I'd go for the leadership piece, really, Lutfey, and not just in the context of we as leaders, but remembering that most of us have leaders under us who are themselves leaders. So how do we look for diverse styles of leadership? And how do we look for the quiet person who has a different style of leadership? And, my favorite quote on leadership is the 5 types of leader, where the first they hate, the second they respect, the third they love, and so on and so forth. And the best leader of all is the one who the people say they've done it all by themselves. So that's a very Asian thing. And to what I just said, a lot of us sort of embody that trait. How do we look out for people like that? How do we bring them also into the conversation? And that will also increase diversity. So ourselves as leaders and looking for diversity, but also looking for diversity in leadership styles in those who are leaders and perhaps, you know, reporting to us and so on within the organization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Grace.
You know, I'm an economist, so I always am drawn to incentives. And I think, you know, having some partial part of the incentives that are actually linked to the team and their progress with respect to D&I makes a lot of sense. We've already heard my thoughts on supply chain management. And I think particularly with respect to the S and ESG, one of the things that we're trying to do in the Inclusion Initiative is really measure the S. And the reason that we want to measure the S is because we do think that customers will care whether or not a company is caring about inclusion and diversity. But ultimately, we also think investors will care, particularly investors who take this kind of medium to long run perspective. And, you know, I think a lot of the inertia often comes down to a narrative, actually. People will talk about clients' preferences or customers' preferences or the shareholders' preferences. And I think putting that to the test could be really, really interesting if we show people the link between the S, P&L, creativity, innovation. We show that that actually links over the medium and the long run, and we let them then place their money based on the data that we actually put in front of them. So again, if we think about the different levers that we can pull, I think measuring the S in ESG is one that hasn't been explored fully in the same way that the E has.
Right. And for me, the learning, again, coming from a more traditional macroeconomics background, where I like to think in terms of, you know, universal rules and universal policies. The fact that here we're talking about experimentation, trying things out, see what works, crank up what does, and, you know, bring down what doesn't. The fact that there are local contexts, regional contexts, global contexts. Its systems change, so it doesn't happen with one firing of a silver bullet. It's the turning of the flywheel over and over again. The fact that a single global policy rolled out uniformly may not be appropriate, particularly if you've got major centers in the multinational. That culture of trial and error and experimentation and data gathering, being honest about effectiveness or otherwise of policies, that to me was new, frankly, in the last 1 year that I've been involved with the Inclusion Initiative. And I think also in the industry, I feel now that openness, which perhaps wasn't there until a few years ago, where here's the policy, you know, execute on it, here's the dashboard, come back, fill up the dashboard and send it upstream. That used to be the culture. So that's quite encouraging for me to see. We have almost come to the end of our time. One last round, if anyone would like to make any pressing closing comments?
I just want to say one thing, Lutfey. So for everyone listening, I do think inclusion starts with them. So very often we look to the companies, we look to the brand. And I think today, for me, the idea of the inclusive leader, maybe you can't change the organization, but you can definitely change the culture within your team and bring along talent, equalizing opportunities. And then we don't see the downstream outcomes, pay and promotions being as severe as they are today.
Dawid, I saw you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to very quickly say, you very kindly mentioned, Lutfey, at the start that I was one of the co-founders of a platform called 10,000 Black Interns. And what we've done there is we've just reached out to not just the asset management space where we started, but now to 24 different sectors. And we've asked a very simple question, which is, would you take on a Black graduate for a 6-week internship? You pay them the minimum living wage or better. So it's not, you know, it's not arduous from your perspective. Would you take on just one? And we've done that across so many sectors that we now have 2,000 internships on offer. We've had 10,000 applicants and we're good to go. So 10,000 Black interns is over the next 5 years, 2,000 for 5 years. And a lot of people look at it and kind of like, well, how did you make that happen? Like, you know, not just me, but the team. It's pretty big and pretty amazing in terms of impact, and it's hugely scalable. The simple answer is that we kind of took a leaf out of the book of, I don't know if any of you know Clay Shirky, but Clay Shirky is a writer in the US. The book is a bit dated now, but he wrote a book called Here Comes Everybody. And in that book, he talks about, he kind of wrote it at the dawn of the internet, but his point was, we now have a technology and we're now entering an age where everyone can start to work together in a way we've never seen before. And that's what underpinned 10,000 Black interns, was everybody came to the party. Like, we thought maybe if we asked 100, maybe 20 would say yes. Everybody said yes. And then we kept going, and then 200 said yes. And we kept going, we got to 750, everybody said yes. And I do think that maybe if I was just to close, I would just round out with this, that if we can just have a place where everybody is coming together in all our industries and are saying, we need to change this, and having conversations like this and locking hands, then I think change actually starts. Suddenly you're, okay, you know, you have a movement, the flywheel that you talked about, Lutfey, starts to move.
And that is a terrific note to end on. I just want to thank all of the panelists. Philip, it's 10:30 p.m. You're in the office. Thank you especially to you. Ida, it's the start of your day. So thank you to all of you for giving us your extremely valuable time. It's been a terrific learning experience for me, and I'm sure a wonderful experience for our audience. So until next time, take care and bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.